theatre maker and actor. So I'm performing a show called Orphan Planet. It's a one-man show that explores grief, but through the metaphor of space. So the kind of main premise of the show is when I was 18, I was given a box of my dad's last possessions. He had kind of curated this odd little box filled with wallets and photographs and mainly loads of videotape. So the story is about me finding my dad's box and finding out who my dad was and kind of discovering a bit more about myself through that. The videotape that I found in the box is woven through the show. And then the show is also about a group of NASA scientists who decide to build a satellite called the Voyager satellite. And the Voyager satellite is this really, really remarkable little satellite that is now the furthest thing that's ever left Earth. It's left our solar system, is still going. But inside Voyager is a record, like a vinyl record, except it's made of gold. And if you play the record, it gives you messages about Earth, and it plays you music from Earth. So the idea was that if an alien came upon it and was like, "Ooh, what is this thing?" they could just find this vinyl record and play it and figure out who we are. So the show is about sending messages, I suppose, and sending messages across time. The thing of my dad building this memory box, knowing that he would not be able to survive in order to meet me, but building this little memory box and hoping that it would reach me. And then these scientists knowing that they're not going to survive to the time where they're going to meet extraterrestrials, but they thought maybe if we put this thing together and send it through, we might find something. And then in the middle of all of that in the show, it's me making the show happen. There's an element to the show where the character that I kind of play, which is an altered version of myself, is kind of finding it. The character thinks at the start of the show it's one kind of show, and by the end of the show it's completely different. So in the midst of all of this, there's me kind of trying to reach out to whoever the audience is that night and give them a little bit of kind of hope and a little bit of hope. Where the show gets its title from, An Orphan Planet. An Orphan Planet is a planet which, for some reason, has been knocked out of its solar system. Most solar systems, all solar systems have a star and then planets that circle around them, and the planets might be like gas giants like Jupiter. They might be like weird, quirky little planets that are too hot to live on or too cold. There's some Earth kind of planets out there. But then there are these other things called orphan planets. And what an orphan planet is it was a planet that was revolving around the sun, and because of something happening, like another planet colliding with it, or an asteroid or whatever, it gets knocked and it goes off into space and loses connection with its star. And because it loses connection, it doesn't have any heat, so it will die, and it just becomes a kind of rock, even to the point where we can't see them because they have no light, they're reflecting no light back, so we don't know where they are. And I think I was 15 when I watched a documentary that mentioned Orphan Planet. And since being a 15-year-old, that's stuck in my brain. It's stuck in my brain as a really good metaphor for what happens, what the worst case scenario could be when someone close to you dies. The worst case scenario is that you suffer a loss. It doesn't even need to be a person, it could be a relationship or whatever, but you suffer a loss and everything falls apart and you end up kind of like with nothing. And I held on to that for a really, really long time. And then some other elements came in, finding my dad's box, hearing these stories about these amazing scientists, Andrew and Carl Sagan, their story. And then it became this kind of like braid that began to like just kind of tie together.
I'm Amanda Collins and I'm the director of Orphan Planet. I think one of the interesting things about working on the show is this question about also how we tell stories, because there are multiple stories in the show. There's stories that are kind of about science, about kind of the history of NASA a little bit, particularly about kind of Carl Sagan, who did this great TV program called Cosmos and really kind of shared his love of kind of science with the world, and the woman that he was in love with, Anne Duran. So there's their stories, there's Danny's stories, there's the stories people have told him about his parents. There are stories about people that I've never met but somehow feel really alive in this. So there's something really interesting about how stories are kind of woven together, and that essentially for me is one of the great things about theatre, because we come into a theatre space to share stories, because stories make us feel stuff, stories teach us stuff, they provoke stuff, they're a way of sharing, they're a way of remembering. So I think there's something really important about the power of stories and what stories we're going to leave behind us when we go wherever we go, when we leave this world.
Just an odd little side note about Orphan Planet is that in this documentary that I saw when I was 15, they called them Orphan Planets, but they're officially called Rogue Planets. So if you Google an Orphan Planet, you probably won't find much, but if you Google a Rogue Planet, but Rogue Planet sounds a bit too American for me and it doesn't sound as cool. I think an Orphan Planet is cooler. A lot of the events in the show, they're not necessarily chronological, but there's events in the show that essentially happen on stage exactly how they happened in my real life. There's a moment in the show where I have a phone conversation with a guy called Dave, and that is pretty much it's pretty much verbatim, that conversation. There's stories, anecdotes from my family, things that happened between Anne and Carl. So it was this kind of magical braid that started to kind of like come together in time, with this idea of an orphan planet at the centre of it, being a metaphor for like the worst case scenario in grief. I was a member of the Theatre Royal's lab company, and because of COVID restrictions we couldn't create a piece of theatre as a full-on company, so they decided to kind of divide up everything. So if the company wanted to be broken up and perform their own shows, I chose to do a one-man show, Orphan Planet. So that was 2021, and I did a really early version of it in the lab. There was a lot of elements, a lot of the key elements were already there, but I did this very kind of early version of it in the lab, and then I was asked to come back to the lab for 3 nights, and the show kind of developed even more. We were then asked to do the drum, which I was kind of astounded by. I never thought I would do a show in the drum, but it was really, really cool. Quite scary, but it was really cool. And then since then, so that was 2021 in the lab. So since 2021, off and on. And then we've kind of brought the show back in what's its kind of final form now, to Barnstable Fringe. We started in Barnstable Fringe, and now we're kind of doing a small little tour. And that's why we're here in Exeter, Barnfield, the Northcote.
I got involved very early on in the show. So it was first developed at the lab at Theatre Royal Plymouth, and Danny was a member of the lab company, and this was during COVID, so there was a real sense of, normally they all come together to create a show, and this time they were working in much smaller groups, and Danny had this idea of doing something that was kind of semi-autobiographical, so there was a connection to him and his family, but also had this connection to kind of the story of Carl Sagan and Anne Duran and the kind of Voyager satellite. So he had asked me to come in initially as a bit of a mentor to kind of work on some of the dramaturgy of it, and as the show's developed, I've become kind of the director of it, and it's kind of grown. It's had a few incarnations, and started in the lab. We did another show in the lab with a kind of R&D process in between. Then there was a bit of a space, then it was done in the drum. But again, always kind of going back over the first kind of 2 years to kind of an R&D process. So it was quite a slow evolution. It's changed a lot. It's had moments added in and it's had moments taken out. I suppose in some ways it also has changed from the very kind of seed ideas Danny had, because often we went through this process where he'd bring in kind of sections. So because it is a kind of devised, created, kind of semi-written piece by Danny, there's been this kind of composition process where we often have elements in a room and we're kind of connecting them together or taking them apart. But it's been really helpful having time between the performances. So often we went, like one of the big things, for example, is the Carl and Anne thread. The initial incarnation had some of that, but there was a real sense of, we needed more of that and we need to develop that. And often we had parts in the early shows where we were like, this kind of works, but we haven't fully discovered what it is we want. And now I think we've got to that place where it's taken time, but the show's evolved into what it's needed. So I think for anybody who's watched it, there will be certain bits where they're like, oh yeah, that has changed, but actually the core of it in some ways hasn't either.
Ooh, 3 words. Hopeful. I would describe it as hopeful, open, and vulnerable. Hopeful, open, and vulnerable is how I would describe the show, with a bit madness thrown in there as well.
Touching, life-affirming, and fascinating.
After much deliberation about what my favourite line is, there's a moment, this is a bit of a spoiler, but there's a moment where a character confesses his love for another character, and he says, for keeps, and that's all he says, for keeps. Yeah, and that's a real thing as well, apparently. He really said, Carl Sagan said it to Anne.
There is a line that Danny says about the tape that his dad wanted to leave to him, and that maybe his dad thought the best thing for him was his meditation mixtape. I think that's one of my favourite lines. I think the show raises lots of questions. And one of the things that's been kind of really key to us is there's a lot of the show that's very personal to kind of Danny and him sharing his stories. But what we want is that to open up the audience and their experience and their stories. Obviously there's a lot about how we process grief, how we process death, how we remember people, what are our legacies. And I think we'd want the audience to kind of come on that journey with us, maybe question some of their own experiences, but ultimately, even though we're sometimes touching on stuff that's quite painful, that there is an uplifting sense of how we remember those we've lost, how we find ways to send stuff on into the kind of universe and into the ether. So I think one of the big things that we want is, by the end of it, the audience to have hopefully laughed, maybe cried, but also to feel uplifted by it.
Yeah, the show can be a bit of a tearjerker, and it hits people in a lot of ways, because I think it's that thing of the show is talking about something that's really deeply personal to me, and in a lot of ways can be really specific to me, but actually having to kind of grapple with grief and experience grief is a real fundamental part of being human, right? Like, you can't be human without kind of like taking a couple of knocks along the way and experiencing this stuff, right? You can't kind of just like hermetically seal yourself in a bubble. So I guess the kind of show is about being really open and honest and going like, this has been my experience, but relating to these things that are just like kind of fundamental to being human. We've all kind of looked up into the sky and gone, bloody hell, it's big, isn't it? Space is big. Like, I can't get my head around how big space is. I can't get my head around how big the sun is. Can't get my head around the fact that, like, even though it's far, far off into the future, the sun's going to explode and everything's going to be, you know, it's so, and in a lot of ways, grief can be really, really similar. But by kind of just being open and honest and talking about it, I think we actually find a lot to be really hopeful for, and a lot to be comforted by, because, and it kind of relates back to the show, but it's all about these like it's kind of like little acts of faith, I suppose, or maybe like acts of hopefulness. Like these two mad scientists, Carl Sagan and Anne Duran, just kind of like put together their own little box, right, and just sent it out into space, and it's still going and it's still out there, and it will still go until the universe ends, I suppose, really. And isn't that just like amazing? Isn't that incredible? And like, if they can do that with their kind of hopefulness, maybe there's an element of like, even in our struggles with grief, whatever that be, might be like losing someone, we can find a kind of hopefulness that we can stay connected somehow. I'm not sure, that might seem really kind of heady, but you know, I know people who have heard a voice note from someone who has passed away, and feeling really feeling a lot of kind of comfort from that, or you know, those famous stories of like letters being lost in the post for 50 years and then suddenly being delivered, or you know, telescopes in space hearing signals coming from all sorts of directions. You know, I think it's just a real kind of, it's a real thing that we as humans seek quite a lot. And I think audiences listening to the story, I hope would feel quite a lot of comfort, I think.